The African slave trade is an excellent topic to write about when we're talking about Regents' Review and human rights violations. It happened between 15 and 1800. Keep in mind, the slave trade is not the same thing as imperialism. Sometimes people tend to forget that as they go through the Regents. The roots of slavery. Slavery had existed for many years in many societies in Africa. Specifically in ancient Egypt, rival tribes were used as slaves, etc. In the 1500s, the slave trade grew into this worldwide phenomenon that would last almost 300 years. The reason for it was that they were brought to America to work on plantations. There was a need for slaves, and native populations died from disease and overwork. Remember, the natives that were working there were susceptible to European diseases. Almost 80 to 90% had already died off. So for the rest, this was an opportunity, okay, for new labor to come in and work. Also, you have ethnocentrism as a reason for a cause of the slave trade. They believed that Europeans believed that they were better than the African population and that they were better off doing manual labor than the Europeans themselves. So Europeans needed help from Native Americans who knew the area, and that's why they got the slaves. And European slave traders would supply Africans with guns, clothing, rum, etc., and Africans would bring members of other tribes to the African coast to the slave ships. So you do have Africans actually helping Europeans in order to make sure that their own tribes were not susceptible to getting caught and enslaved themselves. So one of the major issues here that we deal with on a regular basis here. The infamous triangular trade came about as a result of this. Leg one of the trade was bringing manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. These manufactured goods were then traded for slaves. The slaves then made their way over the Middle Passage to America. And here in America, you see that they are in exchange for raw materials. But the slaves are going to work here in the Americas to kind of cultivate these raw materials and send them off to Europe to be made in the factories into finished products. And it's known as a triangular or transatlantic slave trade. Here's another good visual that shows you how many, the destinations of these African slaves and how many are brought over. Sometimes on the Regents, they like to use these charts to show you, hey, this is where they're going. And the large percentage of them went to the West Indies. That's always your number one choice. And notice how they come from the West African coast. Traditionally, that's where many came from. The same spot that we had the Trans-Sahara trade routes early on in the 13th and 14th centuries. You see the expansion of this slave trade, and it hits its height between 17 and 1800, and that's really no surprise. The reason being that this is the real height or the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and we have the demand for those raw materials during this time period. The second leg of the journey has the infamous title, the Middle Passage. It was called this because obviously it's the middle of the triangular trade, the second leg in the trading route, and it was a 3-month journey. Slaves were packed into the bottom of the ships. A quarter of all slaves actually died on this journey. Many times they were brought up to dance on the open decks to stay looking fit so that they would be worth something when it came auction time for these slaves. On board, the captain had a decision to make. It was either a tight pack or a loose pack. The tight pack slaves were loaded lying on their sides to fit more bodies, and the loose pack slaves were on their backs. More survived the journey that way, though, so it was always a dilemma. But nonetheless, you could see by the diagrams here how the slaves were very tightly packed onto these ships. Many did not survive. Sometimes aboard ships, nearly half didn't survive, and it was a brutal, brutal process for these individuals. Slaves were occasionally, like I talked about, taken up onto the deck to exercise so their muscles would not go limp. This was something that was very important because they were going to work when they reached the Americas. Remember that. The slave trade was devastating, and the effects on Africa were huge. 20,000 million slaves were taken. Obviously, this is going to disrupt the economic prosperity of West Africa in particular. Populations just vanished. Entire tribes vanished along the way. Communities lost their youngest, strongest, and best members. Africans became dependent on European goods that they received. and great African civilizations decline. We don't see Ghana, Mali, and Songhai anymore. Africa truly reaches a dark period in history as a result of this. American plantations flourish with the labor sources that were there. And with the introduction of new technologies like the cotton gin, it became even more in demand to have these slaves in the Americas. And because of this, because of the fact that you had these tribes fighting amongst each other, conflict in Africa became huge, and tribal warfare was a big-time effect of the slave trade. African cultures also developed the influence in the Americas. That's another effect. But for the most part, what we want to focus on is the negative effects of the slave trade. You have the depopulation that takes place on a regular basis. You have tribes being wiped out. You have basically a dark age in African history. And you also have tribal warfare that's going to start between the different tribes. That's the end of this podcast on slavery.